Welcome back, friend and foe to counsel and might. This is going to address Romans chapter 8:29. I got a question from my good friends Mark and Miriam. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son. And the question was specifically about for whom he did foreknow. I tried to do this thing live like 3-4 times. Finally kind of got it down. Better to do it this way over here. I hope this audio is better. What is going on here? When the Bible says for whom he did foreknow, then he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son. Now, I've got a previous video about this second part here. He also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son. There is no predestination to salvation in the Bible. There's predestination to be conformed to the image of the Son of God, which is also spoken of as the adoption, which is defined by Paul explicitly as the resurrection body, the redemption of our body at the rapture, when we actually take on physically the image of the resurrected Son of God. So that is it's a blessing connected with salvation. It's a perk of salvation, which is to get a resurrection body like Jesus Christ. In the Bible, God has not predestinated the lost to salvation. He has predestinated the saved to inherit a resurrection body, just like Jesus Christ's body. I've dealt with this in a previous video called No Predestination to Salvation, and you could probably see it at the top of the screen here. So I'm not going to deal with that here today. Today we're going to speak specifically about the aspect of foreknowledge over here when he says for whom he did foreknow. In Calvinism, and I was a Calvinist for 3 years, foreknowledge is confounded with predestination. Now, there's a reason why that has to be done. It's not because they cannot, well, sometimes Calvinists tend to be intelligent kind of Christians. And it's not because most of them, at least, the teachers, the academicians, it's not because they cannot mentally discern between the concept of predestination and foreknowledge, because they are different. I mean, if I see a kid running towards a wall and I foresee he's going to hit the wall and then he hits the wall, that doesn't mean that I cause him to hit the wall, but simply put. But it's because the system demands it. It's a necessity to make the system survive. And I'll get into that maybe a little bit more after that. But just to show you that there's a difference between predestinate and foreknowledge, Paul says for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate. So predestination is not unconditional. It is conditional on the foreknowledge of God. And of course, we can debate what that is. But what I'd like to show you is, forget foreknow for a second. Here's predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son, that might be the firstborn among many brethren. Look at called. Is called the same thing as predestinate? Is justified the same thing as predestinate? Is glorified the same thing as predestinate? Now, what you'll notice is, in speaking with our Calvinist friends, if you debate them, they either jumble up the concepts and let them bleed one to another, or they are very insistent on distinguishing between these concepts. Like predestination is one thing, election is another, salvation is one thing, the calling is another, justification is one thing, glorification is another. So they either very much distinguish between those concepts, or they will kind of just jumble them all up into an amorphous bulb, low resolution bulb, as the case is needed, as the argument needs. Which shows you that that's not a really good way of doing things, because you can't really mess with the concepts based on the need of the argument. So what I would suggest is, if glorified is not predestination, and the calling is not predestination, and the justification is not predestination, then neither is the foreknowledge predestination. Those are two different concepts. Also, when you come with any kind of systematic, when you come to the text with a presupposition, you're going to see it in the text. You have colored lenses that color how you read the text. And Calvinism has a lot of that. It comes preloaded with a connotation attached with the buzzwords. So when you hear election, predestination, right? Already those buzzwords create in your mind a sense. There's a sense that you're bringing to the text. And then you see that the text, the wording of the text resonates with the system. But that's normal, because the system has used the wording of the text to build itself up. So of course you're going to find the system in the text. You've used the words, but you've infused them with a different meaning. So as a Calvinist, when you come and you see those words, you're like, well, I believe in predestination. There's predestination in the Bible. I believe in election. Oh, I see the word elect in the Bible. So the Bible must be talking about my system. So my system must be biblical. But that you've deceived yourself, because you have actually imbued the words predestination, election, with a sense that is extra biblical. And now that you see that the words, the tenor of the words in the text resonates with that system, you think that that system is being proved scripturally when it isn't. So I'll give you an example. I've used this before. Somebody has asked me, they've showed me a blank piece of paper. They say, what color is it? I said, white. What color is snow? I said, white. What color is a lamb's wool? I said, white. What color is milk? I said, white. They asked me, what do cows drink? And I said, I don't know what you answered, but if you answered milk, it's wrong. Cows don't drink milk. They drink water. Why'd you answer milk? Because you were primed for the color white. I fell for it. And then a few months ago, a friend asked me, said, how do you spell stop? I said S-T-O-P. They asked me, how do you spell shop? I said S-H-O-P. They said, what do you do at a green light? I said, you stop. And they're like, you don't stop at a green light. You go. I'm like, oh man, I can't believe it. I got primed. That's exactly how it works. You've got primed to see predestination as God in eternity past pre-selecting the elect few to salvation, when that is not a biblical concept. That is not how the Bible uses the word predestination or foreknowledge or glorification or calling or justification or election. Here's another example. You talk about election. Well, depending on which circle you're running in, you're already primed for a sense of election, for a connotation of the word election. So if you are running around reformed circles, you hear election, it's like, bang, election, bang. You immediately think of God has sovereignly chosen the elect few from before the foundation of the world onto salvation, and he has reprobated the rest or passed by the rest. It's almost like, I don't know if you ever see that, one of the Avengers movies. Apparently the armies do that. They got this guy, the Winter Soldier, in a prison cell, and then the interrogator comes, and if you say a list of words in the right sequence, random unconnected words, but if you see them in a proper sequence, that becomes an activation code to activate something in the brain where he splits his personality and begins to function as a puppet in the hands of his masters. It's a little bit like this. It's like foreknowledge, bang, predestinate, bang, election, bang, boom. So, Calvinism engaged.
Желание. Ржавой.
Stop.
12.
Stop.
Разведь. Jedź. Nie wiedź. Dobre kacze wtedy. Возвращение на родину. Один. Грузовый вагон.
Солдат. Я готов отвечать.
If you're in those circles, therefore, you hear the word election, you're thinking Calvinistic election. If you're running around political circles, let's say you're a person who knows no Bible and you're a politician all your life and you've grown up in a political household, you hear election, you're thinking going to the polls and voting for a candidate to be the ruler of your people. Election in those circles has a completely different connotation than what the word election has in Reformed circles. And so the politician is going to come reading into the Bible, and he sees election, he's probably going to think political election, because he has this preloaded connotation of the word that he's reading into the text, thinking he's finding justification for it. And Calvinism does the same thing, and any systematic really does the same thing. So if I look at the context to know a little bit what's going on, Romans 6, 7, 8 should be read as a unit, just like Romans 9, 10, 11 should be read as a unit. All right, Romans 6, Paul has spent the first 5 chapters arguing for justification by faith without the works of the law. And then Romans 6 is written to the guy who wants to take advantage of the fact that he's under grace so he can live after the flesh. Romans 7 is written for the guy who's fighting against the flesh and losing, and he's discouraged, so that's a comfort to him. And Romans chapter 8 is in fact about the fact that God has predestinated the saved, that one day they'll have a glorification body and that they will not have to deal with their fallen flesh anymore. That is the context of Romans chapter 8 coming into this. And the meaning of conform to the image of his son is obtaining the resurrection body so you can have a changed flesh. Boom. Let's talk foreknowledge now. I want to show you how the lexicons have been infected with Calvinism. And so even going to the lexicon is not going to solve the issue of what foreknowledge is. This is the Blue Letter Bible, great resource, free. And this is Romans chapter 8:29. Here's the Textus Receptus Greek. There's the Greek. The root word is prognosko. And if I click on it, on Strong's number, watch what you get. They'll give you, for example, Thayer's Greek lexicon. I'll show you all. Now, in his unabridged lexicon, Thayer is honest enough, even though he was part of a Congregationalist church and he was Calvinistic, Thayer is honest enough to at least let you know, he puts in a parenthetical note here, against those who in the preceding passages from Romans explain prognoskein as meaning to predestinate, see Mayer, Philippi, and Van Hengel. So he tells you there's some scholars who disagree with the interpretation of foreknowledge as predestination because Calvinism, and you'll see why, I'll mention why in a minute, has redefined, has blurred the lines, confounded foreknowledge and predestination, which they are not the same thing. So he puts the note in there. If you go up, the Blue Letter Bible at the top, before they give you Layer's unabridged lexicon, they've got an outline of biblical usage. And if you click on that, they tell you that Larry Pierce is the one that put that together. Well, he put that together using Thayer's lexicon and Smith's dictionary. And Thayer has an abridged version called Thayer's Greek Definitions. In the abridged version, and understandably, he doesn't put that little parenthetical mark. In the abridged version, all you've got in Thayer's lexicon is this, that foreknowledge means to have foreknowledge beforehand. Okay, that's commonsensical. To foreknow, yes. And then 2a, he says, of those whom God elected to salvation. And number 3, to predestinate. Hang on a second. Where is that? You know, here's what happened. He puts of those whom God elected to salvation because he's reading Romans chapter 8. Here's how the Calvinist mind reads it. Instead of for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son. They'll read it, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be saved. They read conformed to the image of his son as saved. But it doesn't say saved. Also, they confound predestination with election. So the Calvinist mind goes, for whom he did foreknow, he also elected to be saved. But is that what it says? If you have your senses exercised to discern both good and evil by reason of use, Hebrews chapter 5 says, you discern and you distinguish differences. Sometimes you can overplay the differences, granted, but you should discern the differences with your taste buds. Cannot the mouth taste meat and ear taste words, Job says. So you're supposed to discern subtleties and nuances. It doesn't say he also did elect to be saved. It said he did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son, which is, as I said, a predestination to have a resurrection body like Jesus Christ. Again, see my video, no predestination to salvation. That's why Thayer's got this. And he says to predestinate. Now here you see, predestinate, he has foreknowledge as predestination. Even if in 1 Peter 1, the King James Bible translators translated the prognosko, the base word, as foreordain. Ordain doesn't have the Calvinistic sense that they think it does. Ordain is just to prepare, to ready. And see my video on that on Acts chapter 13, verse 48, which I'll put up there. So there's a lot of background work that's already been done here, okay, guys? I encourage you to check those out. But just to show you how those lexicons have been infected. All right, so in the Calvinistic understanding, if I go back here to Romans chapter 8, I'll give you the Calvinistic understanding in a second. Maybe you'll better understand why it is they confound foreknowledge with predestination when you first see the Arminian take. And Arminianism, all that Arminianism is soft Calvinism. Arminians are basically Calvinists who experience the cognitive dissonance of a God that overrides human free will. They're like, no, we have to make some room for free will over here. And so my guess is if you're not a Calvinist, you're probably still reading this as in Arminian with some degree of accuracy as far as the truth goes. Because the Arminian position is, well, God foreknew who would get saved. Like he foreknew who would of his own free will believe in Jesus Christ. And so he predestinated them to salvation, given that he foresaw that they would believe of their own free will. And that understanding is partly right and partly wrong, because as we said, the predestination is not unto salvation. So you could say God foreknew who would get saved. That is certainly true, and I don't see how anybody can deny that. Some Bible teachers are so adamantly anti-Calvinist that anything that even smells of Calvinism they're going to avoid, and I think that's an overcorrection. Who would argue that God didn't foreknow who would get saved? The only way some people argue it, so here's where the Calvinists come in. They confound foreknowledge and predestination together for two reasons. One is on philosophical ground. So for them, God is ineffable, and of course he is. He is timeless, and of course he is. And so he inhabits eternity, and so he's outside of time. And being outside of time, nothing ever occurs to him. You've probably heard some preachers ask you the question, has it ever occurred to you that nothing ever occurred to God? So the Calvinist God is very philosophical. In fact, Calvinism is a Gnostic reading of the scriptures. There's a lot of parallels between Calvinistic philosophy and Gnostic philosophy. In Gnostic philosophy, Aristotle, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, maybe Plato through the mouth of Socrates or vice versa, they basically say God is an eternal state of contemplation. That is actually Eastern mysticism. It's the Buddha that's always contemplating. So he's outside of time. He never realizes anything. He never discovers anything. There's never a point where he doesn't know anything that suddenly he knows. And when the Bible talks about God suddenly knowing things in time, such as when he tells Abraham, now I know that thou fearest God after he had sacrificed his son, they'll tell you, well, God always did know that Abraham fears God. It's not like he found it out when he sacrificed his son. This is just phenomenal language. It's written in such a way as it's, anthropomorphologically, so he can communicate to us some kind of deeper truth. And so he's not allowed to discover anything because he would cease to be God. And of course, that is to a great extent true, but the problem with that is it's half true. Because God is not only outside of time. It is not enough to say that God is outside of time. God is outside of time and he is in time. He is both. It's like the twin natures of Jesus Christ. He's man and God. God is outside of time and inside of time. And God can, in his sovereign power, choose to limit his access to part of his hard drive, part of his software, part of his RAM, if you will, so he can experience novelty. He wants to find out what Adam is going to call the animals. He wants to find out what's in the heart of Abraham experientially. And so God is not, the God of the Bible is not the philosophical God of eternal contemplation that never experiences novelty. There is one aspect of him that is that, but there is an aspect of him that he submits himself to time and the vicissitudes of time where he can discover things and experience novelty. That is the God of the Bible. It doesn't matter if philosophy doesn't jive with that. But the God of Calvinism is a philosophical God that must be outside of time and cannot be in time, even though the Bible describes him as the Ancient of Days. How can he be the Ancient of Days if he's just outside of time? Think about that. And so because of that, there cannot be this concept of him looking down, this Arminian concept of him looking down the corridors of time and finding out suddenly who would get saved. There was never a point before the point of realization, cognizance of who would get saved. There was never a point beyond that, before that God didn't know. He always knew. So when they hit a verb like foreknow, it's like, well, what do we do with that? Because to foreknow implies that there was a point where he didn't know. And now he knows. And all of a sudden, God looks weak. And so, quick, let us rescue God. Really, the Calvinist God is Humpty Dumpty that falls off a wall, and the king's men have to put him together back again. So they redefine foreknowledge as intimate, salvific knowledge of those who would be saved, of the elect. They define it in the sense of when you read in Matthew chapter 7 and Matthew 25, etc., the passages. When Jesus Christ tells those who come to him, claiming to have known him and served him, he says, I never knew you. In Matthew 7, Matthew 25, I know you not. I know you not whence ye are. In Luke 13 twice. They take it in that sense, intimate salvific knowledge. So God foreknew them, meaning he knew them intimately as the elect in eternity past. And of course, they connect that with Ephesians chapter 1, which says, where Paul tells us, according as he has chosen us in him before the foundation of the world. So that choosing is the foreknowing before the foundation of the world. That's what's happened. Which means that there was a mystical connection between God and the elect before they existed, before the foundation of the world. Which means they were never really lost. They've always ever been the elect from before the foundation of the world. Of course, it's a misreading of Ephesians chapter 1. It's ignoring the fact that the Bible says that we were chosen in him, and we were not in him before the foundation of the world. We got in Christ when we believed, but God foreknew us. He foreknew that we would believe. So the Arminian is right there, and the Calvinist is wrong there. Because of that, because of this philosophical quandary, they've got to redefine foreknowledge as not a prescience and a foresight of things that would happen, but rather an intimate salvific choosing. It's the act of choosing. But then again, you fall into the same problem though, because if there was not a time before which God knew something, how could there have been a time before which God did something? When did the choosing? Because choosing is an act. And just like knowledge happens in time, so does choice. So it doesn't really solve their philosophical problem. Because if you say, well, he foreknew them intimately, all right, well, wasn't there a time before that he didn't foreknow them? It doesn't solve the problem. It's the same issue that you're facing. So you can't solve it unless you accept what the Bible presents, that the God who is in time and outside of time simultaneously, a God that can limit himself, chooses to limit himself in his own sovereign power, and can, at any point he wants, unlimit himself and access that knowledge, that eternal knowledge that's always there in the mind of God. The other reason that they confound foreknowledge and predestination, I'm not misrepresenting Calvinism, guys. I was for 3 years and I've studied this out. I think most Calvinists aren't even aware of those distinctions. But the other reason why they have to confound foreknowledge and predestination, because the Arminian idea of God looking down the corridors of time and finding out who gets saved in their mind renders salvation dependent upon the free will of man, and in their systematic libertarian free will thwarts the will of God, because it really depends on who chooses Christ. And they're like, well, God wills all men to be saved, and if he wills all men to be saved and some men will not to be saved and they end up not saved, then they thwarted the will of God. Again, it's a weak, puny God whose sovereign will can be thwarted by the free will of man. They have to rescue him from that perception. And they'll say, no, because then it would be dependent on you. It's like God foresaw what you would do, but it's not based on what you would do. It's all based on what God would do. It sounds so spiritual and holy and humble. And so that's why they have to redefine foreknowledge, not as foresight, not as prescience, but election, an act of choosing, intimate salvific knowledge unto salvation. So here's the Arminian understanding of it. Not Arminian, Arminian, like Arminius. So you have God, and then you have creation, right? The starting point of creation, there's the cross. And on Arminianism, God foreknows who would get saved. Let's say you got saved, 2010, 2005. God foresaw who would get saved in 2005. And he foresaw that of your own free will you would believe on him. And of course, there's a nuance there, because they're still Calvinists. So they do say man cannot of his own believe, so he must experience a prevenient grace of God that not kind of regenerates him, but that makes him able to exercise free will. So they're still compromised. They're still so stuck in the Calvinistic system, in the mold, they couldn't break free out of it. So all they could do was tweak it. And you need to break free out of it, because the whole thing is wrong. God foreknows, and so he foresees who would get saved. And so back there now, God predestines that person to salvation. That's the Arminian system. Partly right, partly wrong. Why? Why is it wrong, guys? Because predestination is not unto salvation. predestination. Predestination is not the predestination of the lost to salvation. It is the predestination of the saved unto a resurrection body. So Calvinism, as I said, has an issue with that, both philosophically, Calvinism, and on the grounds that this weakens the sovereignty of God. Of course it doesn't, but that's how they see it. So here's God. Here's creation. Now, in their system, God doesn't look down the corridor of time to find out who got saved. The foreknowledge is not that of the eye over here. The foreknowledge of God is intimate salvific foreknowledge. So it's salvific foreknowledge, which is the act of election unto salvation. So that dot there where you got saved here, the dot here in Calvinism is actually here. And it just gets actualized in 2005. But you were elect back here. That's why I illustrate that with let's illustrate this with a dotted line, that there's a connection. But the full circle is here. The filled out circle is here. This is the hollow circle. Because the choice is made here, this is just the fulfillment of it. That's in Calvinism. The Paulinian view, guys, Paul is not discoursing on the Arminian Calvinist provisionist a debate or controversy. That's not what is in his mind. When you come to the Romans 8 and Romans 9, thinking that this is Paul trying to prove Calvinism, or disprove it for that matter, this is not where Paul is living. That's not an issue in Paul's mind. In fact, it wasn't an issue in anybody's mind until Augustine started interpreting the text deterministically, Gnostically, in the 4th century, 5th century. That's not where Paul is living. That is not what he's talking about. That's why at the beginning of the video, I highlighted the fact that the context is deliverance from our flesh. You know, my soul is saved, but I'm still stuck in the body of this flesh. Remember, Romans chapter 7 ends with, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? That's the last thing he says in Romans 7. Romans 8 is on the heels of that, talking about the resurrection body, the adoption that we're waiting for. I assume you're a Bible reader, so I'm not going into all the verses, so the video is not too long. So he's talking about predestination unto a new body. He's not dealing at all. That's not what in Paul's mind at all. If Paul were transported into today's discussions of Romans 8 and 9, he's like, what? I'm not talking about Calvinism or non-Calvinism. Be careful about importing modern controversies into the text when it wasn't the issue. So the Paulinian understanding would be, here's God in eternity past over here, and here's creation, and here's the cross, and here's the guy who gets saved in 2005. Now, known unto God all his works from the beginning of the world. He has chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, both corporately and individually. I don't have a problem with that, but as long as it's in him. You became in him in 2005 if you got saved in 2005. So God, for whom he did foreknow, God foresaw that some people would believe on his son Jesus Christ of their own free will, and he foresaw who those people would be, like, my friends Mark and Miriam. Well, what did he do? He predestinated. The predestination is twofold. There's a predestination that happens in time, and you can say there's a sense in which the predestination and the foreknowledge happen over here, in the sense that he foresees who's going to get saved, and in the mind of God, because Paul tells you that, look at these things here. All the verbs are past tense. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his son, that he may be the firstborn among many brethren. Verse 30, moreover, whom he did predestinate, them he also called. Whom he called, them he also justified. It's done. Whom he justified, them he also glorified. Even the glorification is done. But the glorification is something that you're predestinated unto. I will be glorified in Jesus Christ by obtaining a resurrection body, hopefully by being crowned by him and being allowed to rule with him. But there's a sense in which I've already been glorified in the mind of God in eternity past, because God has chosen us in Him when I got saved. But back before the foundation of the world, His plan was that which is a blessing, we should be holy and without blame before Him in love. Being allowed to stand before God is a glorification aspect. It's not a salutary aspect. You can get saved without being allowed to be in the presence of the King. You can be a citizen of the city without being allowed to be in the presence of the King. That is not salvation. That is a blessing accompanying salvation. That's why Paul opens up Ephesians with telling you that God has blessed us with all spiritual blessings where in heavenly places. Where do you stand before Him? In the heavenly places. What is that? A blessing accompanying salvation. Having predestinated us unto the adoption of children, not salvation, that is the resurrection body. Again, see my video, no predestination unto salvation. So the glorification over here happens over here. There's glorification in the mind of God. Glorification is past. He glorified us in the mind of God in the past, but there's glorified over here also the actualization of the purposed glorification. And that is predestinated to bear the physical image of Christ. That the predestination happens here. And in a sense, the foreknowledge also happens here. Not only there's a foreknowledge of in the mind of God in eternity past, but, elect according to the foreknowledge of God, Peter tells us. But there's also a sense in which, now I'm switching, this is a second edge of the sword. Remember, the word of God is a two-edged sword. There is a way to interpret the foreknowledge of God as happening in time, in the sense that it's relative to the act of predestinating in time, not in the sense that it's from eternity past. There's a sense in which the foreknowledge, the fore, is in the sense of first, in the sense of precedingly, not necessarily from eternity past. Because the verse doesn't tell you it's from eternity past. You can understand that from 1 Peter, from Ephesians 1 maybe, but you can understand it as relative to the predestination, which happens in time. You are predestinated here, and you're predestinated, but first you're foreknown in the sense that you got saved. Where'd you get that from? From Galatians chapter 4. And watch how they're similar, those texts. Galatians chapter 4 is a surprisingly parallel passage to Romans chapter 8. And it's also a passage that talks about the adoption in reference to the body. Now, when you got saved, you got the spirit of adoption. You didn't get adopted. You got the spirit of adoption. I know some people, I'm going to get that in the comment. Galatians 4 says we have the spirit of adoption. Exactly. You have the spirit of adoption, which is the earnest of their purchased possession, according to Ephesians chapter 1, until the day of redemption. The spirit of adoption is basically God signed the paperwork. Daddy Warbucks came to Annie's orphanage, if you remember the movie, signed the paper, but Annie hasn't been transferred yet from the orphanage to the mansion of Daddy Warbucks. I likewise, the paper is signed, I have the spirit, the earnest, the down payment, but I haven't been adopted yet. That is when, at the resurrection day. Look at Galatians 4 and Romans 8 and see how parallel they are. It's an eye-opener. So follow the color coding. Romans chapter 8, Paul says, for what the law could not do in that it was weak through the flesh, God sending his own Son in the likeness of sinful flesh and for sin condemned sin in the flesh, that the righteousness of the law might be fulfilled in us. Look at Galatians 4, same author, Paul says, God sent forth his Son, made of a woman, made under the law. Look at the yellow, for you have not received the spirit of bondage again to fear, but you have received the spirit of adoption, whereby we cry, Abba. Paul tells us that to redeem them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons, blue with blue. And in verse 6, and because you are sons, God has sent forth the spirit of his Son into your hearts, crying, Abba, Father, just like Romans 8:15. And there's the adoption in blue again. And if children, he tells us in Romans 8 on the left side, then heirs. heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. Galatians chapter 4, wherefore thou art no more a servant, but a son, and if a son, then an heir of God through Christ. What I'd like to show you now in gray is the match between for whom he did foreknow, there's foreknowledge. In Galatians 4, Paul says, looking for 4:8, howbeit then, when ye knew not God, ye did service unto them which by nature are no gods. But now, after ye have known God, or rather are known of God, how turn ye again to the weak and beggarly elements, whereunto ye desire again to be in bondage? When have they been known of God? Now. Now. The day you got saved, this is, in that sense, the Calvinists are actually partially right in understanding foreknowledge in the salvific sense. It's an amazing thing. Every heresy has a grain of truth. This is the secondary application of foreknowledge. I've already spoken about God foreseeing who gets saved in eternity past, which is true. That's not wrong. But the other edge of understanding this, in the light of Galatians chapter 4, Paul tells you, now that you're known of God, now. And he's discussing adoption, which is the redemption of our body, according to Romans chapter 8. You know that, right? Waiting, he says, not only they, but ourselves also, which have the first fruits of the Spirit, even we ourselves grown within ourselves, waiting for the adoption, to wit, to know, that is, he defines it, the redemption of our body. So, when are you known of God? Now that you got saved. So that's God knowing you salvifically, intimately. And so since Galatians 4 is discussing the same thing as Romans chapter 8, there's a possibility that what Paul is saying is what he is saying in Galatians chapter 4. He's using foreknowledge in the sense of salvific foreknowledge. So, known, foreknown. And the fore is in reference to the predestination which happens in time. Meaning, before he predestinated you, first he knew you salvifically. Meaning, before you got set to inherit as an heir of Christ, first God knew you. Meaning, God only predestinates the saved to those blessings. For whom he did foreknow, in the sense of for whom he did know salvifically, for whom he did first know. You can take for in the sense of first. For whom he did first save, he also did predestinate to inherit a resurrection body. So if I go back to my illustration, there is a foreknowledge and predestination in the mind of God. He foreknew who would get saved, and he had decided in eternity past that those who would get saved, I'm going to give them a physical body like Christ. So in the sense, the predestination, because God purposed that he would glorify us that way in the mind of God over there, but there's a sense in which also the foreknowledge happens here. First you get saved over here, and then the predestination happens in time. He locks you into the roller coaster, as it were, to get, or in the train, to get a glorified image of Jesus Christ. This would be in line with, depart from me, I never knew you. For whom he did foreknow, the ones he first knew, those are the ones that he predestinate to inherit spiritual blessings and physical blessings, and when the glorification is actualized. And so that's all I've got, guys, according to Hebrews chapter 4, double-edged sword. Two things then. For whom he did foreknow in eternity past, God foresaw that you would believe in Jesus Christ. He did predestinate in eternity past, in the sense that he had purposed to grant you not only salvation, but in accompaniment with salvation, the perk, the blessing of a resurrected body, and also being heir of Christ. That's what he discusses in Romans chapter 8. Remember, he could have saved you without making you an heir. Those are blessings. And there's also the sense in which God first had to know you salvifically to save you, and then in time, once you get saved, God locks you in to get those spiritual and physical blessings of an inheritance with Christ. That is, for whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. I hope that was helpful. Guys, share it if you think that was helpful. Keep us in prayer. Love you. Take care, guys.